Hey, what's going on everyone? Welcome back to Woody's Workshop. Today I have a 2010 X5 with the N62 V8. This X5 has a couple things wrong with it. One of them being it has a coolant leak. So today I'm going to be showing you how to replace these parts right here. This is your valley pan, which comes with the gasket attached to it. And it's always a good idea when you're replacing this valley pan, that's what's leaking on this X5, is this gasket under here. It gets all cruddy and it leaks. I'll show you here once I get it apart. But it's always a good idea when you replace this valley pan to also replace this little bit here that goes between the valley pan and the water pump. And then this is also kind of an additional step here, is this water pipe. So this is a collapsible aftermarket water pipe. It slides in and out, and it's got O-rings that seal the outside diameter of the inner pipe to the inside diameter of the outer pipe. And this pipe sits in this channel. It's much easier to see once I get it apart, but essentially it sits in here and goes between the water pump and the back of the block. So this pipe can be very problematic from the factory. It's a one-piece design. If you were to try and replace it with a factory pipe, it would entail taking the cylinder heads off and pulling the front timing cover and the rear timing cover, pretty much a complete overhaul. So the solution in the aftermarket is to install this two-piece pipe. So you cut the old one out, slide this new one in its place. So with all that being said, let's get right to it. So the first thing you need to do, which I kind of did off camera, is remove your intake air filter box. It's pretty straightforward. There's a couple air pipes that come over here to the front cowl. You just unclip those. There's a screw clamp on the intake pipe going into the throttle body. You undo that, the whole thing pops up. You disconnect your mass airflow sensor here, and it comes up out of the way. You also need to take apart your cowling. This is pretty straightforward. It's held in place with a couple T20 Torx and a couple 10 millimeters. The rain tray that goes over the top is held in with a couple quarter turn 13 millimeter fasteners. Once you get that out of the way, you pull your microfilter housing out, get all that. Pretty much you got to get everything out of the way up here because we're going to be removing this intake manifold to get down to the valley pan. So once you've got all that out of the way, I'm going to start by removing my PCV hoses here. You have one to your passenger side valve cover, one to your intake manifold, and then one to your driver side valve cover. And this encases your PCV valve. So this can be very brittle, and over the years with the heat cycles and everything, underneath this foam it's just corrugated plastic tubing. So be gentle when you take this apart. These parts aren't necessarily cheap to replace, so do your best not to damage them. So I'll go ahead and take those off now. It helps if you have a small 90-degree pick and a decent amount of patience. There you go. So you see here they've just got two little, let's see if I can get it to zoom there. Yeah, you got two little lock tabs. You got to go behind there with your screwdriver, kind of pry them up. Once they're pried up, you really just got to wiggle it back and forth. This O-ring can get really dry and brittle, and it likes to stick to the plastic on the valve cover. So you just got to be really patient, or else you end up snapping it. Make sure you don't pull on this corrugated stuff here, because if you pull it at the wrong angle, you're just going to snap this in half, and it can get really expensive really quickly. So just take your time and be patient with this. Now that you have your PCV valve out of the way, you're going to take a T30 Torx bit and take off the 4 bolts that hold down your harnesses for your injectors. Now I'm going to pop off the injector covers. These just lift straight up. They're held in by just 2 little rubber grommets. Pull these off, get them out of the way. From there, our next step will be to pull both of our valvetronic motors. These are held in place by 4 4mm Allen machine screws. When you loosen these, you probably will hear the valvetronic motor it retract, because the valvetronic eccentric arm inside the valve cover held under spring tension. So when you pull the screw gear out with the valvetronic motor, you will hear a loud clang. That's totally normal. And when you go to reinstall these, you have to spin them in clockwise, and they'll wind back in. Once they're flush with the valve cover, you can then torque them down. Just kind of a side note, they're held in by, you got to disconnect the connectors. There's 2 tabs on both sides. Also, another note for this, you're going to need a long 4mm Allen. You probably could use a 1/4 wrench, but it's a little tricky to get these ones that are between the fuel rail and the valvetronic motor. On the last bolt, when you go to take it out, it's a good idea to put your hand over it because, like I said, it is going to have some spring tension, so it's going to try and pop out. If you don't have your hand over it, it's going to pop out, the machine screw is going to go flying, you're never going to find it again, and then you're going to be in a tough spot when you go to put it back together. So it's a good idea to always put your hand over it and kind of help relieve that tension. There we go. There you can see that's your valvetronic motor. You can see the screw portion of it there. So when you go to reinstall it, that's what I'm talking about. You have to wind this back in clockwise. Once it's flush, you'll be able to torque it down. With the valvetronic motors removed, we're now ready to start disconnecting as much of this harnessing as we can, because essentially we're going to have to lift both banks worth of this harness up and kind of out to the side, spread it to the side, so we'll be able to lift the intake right out of the center. So from here, I'm going to start disconnecting all these connectors, the cam sensors, the power for the valvetronic motor, all of this stuff here, and also disconnect the electrical connector on the throttle body. There's one more hard line, or that black plastic corrugated line that goes to the backside of the throttle body, and that's for your tank vent valve. You have to disconnect that as well. Once we get all that out of the way, be able to unbolt the intake, pull it up. We do have to decide if we're going to pull it with the fuel rail or without the fuel rail. I usually pull it with, so I'll be disconnecting the fuel line, the feed line over here on the side, just underneath the positive battery post. See, I've got my throttle body disconnected, my coolant temp sensor disconnected, my tank vent valve unplugged, and then just the 2 harnesses that actually go here to the injector harness. Once that's out of the way, I'll be able to kind of see what I'm talking about as far as moving this up out of the way. Okay, on the driver's side, you are going to have to, if your harness runs like this, how mine does, underneath the fuel crossover line to go to your driver's side fuel rail, if your harness runs under here like this, it's going to be kind of personal preference for you, whether you want to disconnect, because obviously you won't be able to lift the intake up, given that this goes in between the two, the fuel rail and the intake. So you can either do one of 2 things. You can disconnect every single connector on this harness, which would mean disconnecting the oil pressure sensor, which is down underneath your vacuum pump, disconnecting both your Vano solenoids, disconnecting the control harness for your compressor, all of that stuff. It can be kind of tricky getting down there, very low visibility, pretty much 0. The alternative is you take off this 13, that I'm sorry, not 13, T30, I misspoke there. If you take off that T30 right there, and this T30 back here, that hold down your fuel rail right there, if you take those out, you can take a pry bar and pop this fuel rail up, flip it over, pull the harness to the side, then flop the fuel rail back down. A lot of times if your vehicle has been taken apart once before by a service technician, a lot of times they will put this harness over the top so you don't have this issue. If that hasn't been done, which it hasn't been done on this one, you're kind of stuck in this little predicament. So for me, the easiest thing to do is to pop the fuel rail up. So I'll go ahead and show you how to do that. Once you've got the fuel rail for the driver's side out, you want to just flop it over to the other side. Now you can see this harness is no longer a factor. It's out of the way. We can get to what we need to get to. Our next step is going to be disconnecting the fuel feed line here. There's a little collar on it. You pop this collar off. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to do this one-handed. Probably not. But yeah, there's a little collar there. Take that collar off. Push this in. Squeeze these together, and it'll pop right off. You might want to put a little rag under here, paper towel, whatever you got, to minimize the amount of fuel you spill all over the place. There won't be that much, but just always keep in mind, if you're going to pull the intake with the fuel rail still connected, there's going to be fuel in these lines, so it's going to be dripping, and if you don't want it to drop all over yourself, just pay attention to that. So once we get that fuel feed line disconnected, we can go ahead and start taking off all of the 11mm nuts that hold the intake in place. There is going to be a couple big fat connectors on the back of the intake. Those are going to be much easier for me to show you once I get the intake off. I'm now ready to start taking off all my 11mm nuts. I like to just loosen them to the point where they're just sitting on top of the stud. Then I'll go through with a little magnet and pick them up one by one, just to reduce the chance of dropping. 5 of these on each side of the intake. Alright, so once you got those connectors disconnected on the back and your gloves look like this, you are ready to pull the intake up and out. You will have to lift it over this harness for your ignition coils. Unless for some reason you've got this off, you're gonna have to push it down underneath the throttle body when you lift it up and out. It's kind of being sandwiched between this harness and the harnesses for your fuel injectors. Okay, so my intake manifold's out. The 3 connectors that you've got to get at the back. This one, these 2 are the same. And then this larger connector here. This one has a tab in the center. You push it down, slide it off. These one have little metal spring clips that you push on and pull them off. This connector won't, it does, very stupid, but it does not have enough clearance between here and the valley of the engine to disconnect it without lifting the intake up. So you need to lift the intake up in order to fully disconnect this. That's what you saw in the video, how it's kind of still snagged on there. It's because you can't pull it all the way off without lifting the intake up first. So that's kind of silly, but these are your 2 motors that control the runners for the long and the short runners of your intake. And then this is your manifold pressure sensor. Here you can see the connectors. This is the larger center one, and these are the 2 back ones. You can see they just have these little spring clips, and this one just has the larger push tab. Now that I've got that out of the way, you can see what my problem is here. You can see all this is pretty normal for it to look kind of crummy under here. It collects a lot of dirt and dust and stuff, but the coolant is not good. You can see this is, it's not horrible, but there's definitely a leak here, which can be problematic. So another good idea is when you're replacing this stuff and you're in here messing around, pulling things up and out of the way, there's a pretty good chance you might break this pipe right here. This gets really brittle. Mine looks pretty good, but this gets really brittle and brown and will break off, and then it will leak coolant all over the place. So it's a good idea to have one of those on hand when you're doing this, just as a precaution. They're not that expensive, and they just go from, they're pretty much steam ports. They go from each cylinder head and then wise off to the upper radiator hose right there. So obviously you got to be careful when you're taking that portion off as well, because you can just as easily break the nipple off of the upper radiator hose. So it's all about patience and limiting the amount of damage you do when you're in here, especially on these older vehicles that have you know, a lot of brittle parts and just higher mileage and a lot of heat. On the underside of the truck, if you're seeing coolant coming down the sides of your bell housing, you can kind of see the pathway the coolant's taking. Right there, you can see it. So it'll overflow, fill up this whole area, then it will run down both sides of your bell housing, even seep through the center, and you'll see it dripping either out of the bell housing or around the sides. More than likely, you have an issue with your valley pan. So to get down to the valley pan and the water pipe that sits underneath it, we're going to need to get all this stuff up out of the way. This is your B+ positive battery cable. It wires off here. One comes from the battery, the other one goes down to the starter, and this one comes down around the front of the driver's cylinder head right there and goes down to your alternator. So we're going to need to undo that, lift it up out of the way, or at least raise it enough so we can get the valley pan up and out of the way. We do have to remove this pipe, which is your supply for your heater core. You can see it kind of goes up. It's a little dark under there. It goes up to this little connection here. It goes into your heater core. We will have to move the NOx sensors out of the way. Once we get that stuff out of the way, we can start to undo the 10mm bolts that hold it in place. You got to wiggle it off of this little plastic piece that I was showing you earlier that connects the valley pan to the water pump, and you'll be able to get it up out of there. So let's go ahead and do it. So while that heater core line is draining, I'm going to go ahead and zip off my NOx sensors. Obviously, when you're doing any of this, you want to avoid getting any water or really anything at all in your intake runners. If you're not super comfortable leaving these open, you can always wipe them down, put a piece of tape over them, masking tape over them, or if you want, you can kind of put a rag in each runner if you want to be extra cautious. But it's always a good idea to make sure you're not accidentally draining coolant somehow into the runners or dropping anything at all. If you drop anything here, it could be catastrophic if you were to get something in one of those intake runners. So just always be mindful of that. So with the heater pipe out of the way, battery cable loosened up out of the way, I disconnected the Y pipe, removed my NOx sensors. I'm now ready to take the remaining 10mm bolts out of the valley pan and get it up and out. With the bolts out, you're going to want to take your pry bar and place it right underneath the, pretty much between the front timing cover and the valley pan itself, and kind of just twist it. It'll lift up. You're going to leak coolant all over the place. The majority of it is going to run down the back. Maneuver the valley pan out of the car. With the valley pan out, if you were just going to do the valley pan gasket, at this point you would go ahead, just clean up all the channels around in the little pockets in the cylinder heads, wipe the front timing cover off, and you would just proceed to replace the little black connecting pipe here and the valley pan itself with the gasket. Like I was saying earlier, I am actually gonna go ahead and replace this water pipe kind of as a preventative maintenance. It's a good idea to do it while you're in here, that way you don't have to redo all this, you know, shortly after. But essentially this water pipe, if this is leaking on your vehicle, you will see coolant. I'm gonna try and capture this on the camera as best I can. It's kind of small and hard to see. The flashlight doesn't really help any. There is a weep hole right there, if you can see that. Let me see if I can point at it. Right there on the front timing cover, there's a little tiny hole. And if you have coolant pouring out of that hole, that means that the seal on the front of this pipe is leaking and allowing water to run out and come out of that hole and run down the front timing cover. It's a fairly common leak, especially on higher mileage N62s. So I chose to just go ahead and do this as preventative maintenance. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and suck all the coolant out of here. I'm going to have to cut this pipe in half since it is one piece. So you can see, since it's one piece, to remove this out of here, you would have to take the whole front of the motor apart, take the front timing cover off, and take the rear timing cover off to do it correctly. Obviously that's an awful lot of work just to replace this pipe. So what we're going to do is we're going to cut the one piece pipe, remove the two sections, drop our new collapsible pipe in place, expand it, and that will be our replacement. So at this time I'm going to suck out all the coolant and cut that pipe out and start with the replacement. Got all the water sucked out of the valley. I did put some tape over the intake holes. I forgot about that portion, that I got to cut this out. So I'm just going to use a cutoff wheel. If you have an air saw, that works as well. You just want to cut it kind of somewhat in the middle, and you're going to have to wiggle the two halves apart. There are O-rings on both sides holding them in place, so you're going to need some vice grips or pliers to get them apart. Make sure you don't touch any cables or anything like that, obviously. So you can see why this would leak. It is very cruddy and crappy, so an O-ring is not going to seal that well on that. So now you're going to want to wipe up the remaining coolant in here, any little bits of metal. Ideally, if you had a little hand saw, that might be a little bit better. This is kind of a big cutoff wheel for this type of thing. But I've used an air saw before in the past. I just couldn't find mine, so this is kind of all I had. Not really ideal, but it gets the job done. So the pipe's out now. What you have to do is remove the O-ring in the rear of the engine block. If you can see that, try and make it a little more clear. There's an O-ring right in there that you've got to use a pick to get out. And then on the front timing cover, there's, I'm going to flip the camera upside down, hopefully I can show you inside this. Oh, that's it. Inside that hole there's another O-ring that you've got to pick out, and obviously you got to clean these holes up really good. Additionally, the coolant pipe for the heater core, there's an O-ring in the water pump side right there, that little small O-ring there. You're probably going to want to get a new one of those as well. The last thing you want to do is do all this work, put it together, and then have to take the intake back off because you didn't replace that O-ring and now that pipe is leaking. So I'm going to pull these O-rings out, clean them all up, put the new O-rings in, and get ready to install my replacement pipe. You can see that front seal is just covered in corrosion and really smashed down. A lot of times you can't even get this out in one piece. So here's a note on the front seal. It is tapered on one side, flat on the other. The flat side goes towards the water pump and butts up against the front timing cover. the taper side goes obviously towards the pipe. The pipe will slide in on the taper. Okay, so I've got my collapsible pipe here. Got it all put together, got the ends lubed up. Now it's just a matter of placing it in there, popping it into the front, and then sliding the back end to the back of the engine. It's kind of tricky. It's hard to get it sealed in there correctly. You got to use a pry bar to kind of pop it into the front timing cover. Okay, I got my collapsible water pipe in there. It's expanded, it's clipped in, everything's sealed up. Now I just need to throw my valley pan back on. All right, so you're gonna really wanna lube up the black connecting piece between the water pump and the valley pan, especially if you're replacing it. It's gonna be a really tight fit. Obviously your mating surface here, you wanna clean it off nice with some Scotch-Brite and make sure there's no corrosion or anything there. All the bolt holes for your valley pan, they've probably got coolant in them, so you're gonna wanna go with some compressed air and blow out all the coolant. The torque spec for the valley pan is 10 Newton meters. You want to tighten these down in a kind of like a crosshatch pattern. You don't want to tighten them in a circle. Alright, so I got everything back together. Valley pan's torqued. Water pipes replaced. For me, this is as far as I'm going to go in this video. Kind of just show you replacing that, fixing that coolant leak. Not going to show you the reassembly in this video or the installation of the intake manifold, because some of the other repairs that I've got to make on this entail taking the valve covers off to replace the valve stem seals. So I'm not going to even bother putting the intake manifold back on at this point. I'm just going to leave it as is and kind of go from there. I will be putting it back on obviously at some point, but just not in this video. So as always, if you found this helpful, if you liked the video, please consider subscribing to the channel, and I will catch you next time.